the spring of 1945, George S. Patton believed the war in Europe was already decided. The only question left was how fast it would end. His Third Army had smashed through France, crossed the German border, and was advancing deeper into the Reich at a pace no Allied force had matched. German resistance was collapsing unevenly, but everywhere Patton pushed hard, it gave away. To Patton, the solution seemed obvious. Momentum was everything. The enemy was disorganized, fuel and supplies were captured as quickly as they were spent, and German command and control was breaking down. From a purely military standpoint, slowing down now felt not just unnecessary, but dangerous. Every pause gave the enemy time to regroup. Every redirection felt like an opportunity wasted. Yet at precisely the moment Patton felt most confident, the restraints tightened. Orders redirected his advance. Boundaries mattered more than speed. Supplies were rationed. While Patton focused on what his army could do, higher command focused on what it should not do. From Patton's perspective, this made little sense. He was winning, his army was moving, the enemy was retreating. If victory was within reach, why hesitate now? The answer had little to do with Patton's ability, and everything to do with what came after victory. When Patton later complained that he had not been allowed to finish the war his way, he was not talking about recklessness or chaos. He was talking about exploitation. The doctrine he believed decided modern wars. Once an enemy line cracked, Patton believed the worst mistake was to stop and reorganize. Speed, confusion, and relentless pressure were the weapons that finished wars quickly. For Patton, this meant ignoring rigid boundaries on a map. Army group lines, national sectors, and carefully staged pauses made sense during planning, but not during collapse. In his view, German resistance in the spring of 1945 was no longer coherent enough to justify restraint. What mattered was driving deep, seizing crossings, disrupting retreat, and preventing the enemy from forming any new defensive line. Patton also believed that the fastest way to end the war was the most humane. Every day the fighting continued meant more casualties, Allied civilians and German alike. From that perspective, slowing an advancing army was not caution, it was prolongation. But what Patton never fully accepted was that his solution assumed the war existed in isolation. It treated the defeat of Germany as the final objective, rather than a transition into a far more complicated political reality. His way promised a faster military conclusion, but it did not account for what that conclusion might unleash. By 1945, Dwight Eisenhower was no longer simply concerned with defeating the German army. That problem was already solving itself. His real responsibility was ensuring that the victory did not fracture the alliance that had made it possible. The war in Europe was being fought by a coalition, and coalitions did not end wars the same way single nations do. Eisenhower had to balance American military power with British political influence, French legitimacy, and Soviet expectations. Every major decision carried consequences far beyond the front lines. Allowing one American general to dominate the final advance risked undermining Allied unity at the very moment it mattered most. Victory had to look shared, orderly, and controlled, not seized by the fastest moving force. This was not a question of jealousy or personal rivalry, it was a matter of legitimacy. Europe would have to live with the outcome long after the army stopped moving. If the final phase of the war appeared chaotic, competitive, or unbalanced, it would weaken the political foundations of the post-war settlement. Eisenhower also understood something Patton did not fully appreciate. Perception could be as powerful as reality. Even a successful military dash could be interpreted as an attempt to rewrite agreements or marginalize allies. In a war already transitioning into an uneasy peace, that risk was unacceptable. Patton measured success in miles advanced and enemies defeated. Eisenhower had to measure it in alliances preserved and crises avoided. The restraint imposed on Patton was not a rejection of his ability, it was the price of holding a coalition together at the moment of victory. By the final months of the war, the Allied advance across Europe was governed as much by agreements as by enemy resistance. Lines drawn on maps, often months earlier, now carried enormous political weight. These boundaries were not arbitrary. They reflected hard negotiations between allies who were already thinking about the shape of the post-war world. For Eisenhower, respecting those lines was not a courtesy, it was a safeguard. Soviet forces were advancing from the east under expectations that had been clearly discussed at the highest levels. Any major deviation by Western armies risked being interpreted as an attempt to change the balance of power before the fighting stopped. Even unintentional advances could trigger diplomatic crises at the worst possible moment. Patton, by contrast, saw those lines as artificial constraints imposed on a collapsing enemy. From a battlefield perspective, they often made little sense. German units did not respect national sectors, and opportunities rarely aligned with prearranged zones. To Patton, stopping an advancing army because of a line on a map felt like surrendering initiative without reason. But Eisenhower could not view the map that way. Each boundary represented an agreement already tested by suspicion and compromise. Violating them, even in the name of efficiency, would have raised questions about Allied intentions, especially with the Soviets watching closely. A faster military victory was not worth the risk of undermining trust at the moment it was most fragile. In the end, the map was not a tactical document, it was a political one. And for Eisenhower, keeping faith with that map mattered more than any additional ground Patton believed he could take. By 1945, Patton's reputation was both his greatest strength and his greatest liability. No one doubted his ability to fight and win battles, but war at the highest level depends on trust, and Patton had spent years eroding his own. His public statements, private letters, and offhand remarks repeatedly caused problems for Allied leadership. He criticized allies, dismissed political considerations, and spoke openly about future conflicts that were already taking shape. Even when those views reflected private conversations elsewhere, Patton voiced them in ways that made restraint unavoidable. To Eisenhower, this was not a matter of personality, it was a matter of control. A general entrusted with enormous power had to be predictable, not in tactics, but in judgment. Patton was brilliant on the battlefield, but he was also impulsive, blunt, and often indifferent to how his words would be received beyond his headquarters. This mattered because the war was no longer just about defeating Germany, it was about shaping what came next. Any action taken by Patton would be interpreted not only as a military move, but as a political signal. And Patton had shown time and again that he did not fully accept that distinction. In that environment, giving Patton complete freedom of action would have been reckless. Even a successful dash forward carried risks that Eisenhower could not afford. The leash tightened not because Patton was ineffective, but because he was unpredictable at the exact moment predictability mattered most. Patton believed that if he had been unleashed in 1945, the war in Europe could have ended faster and more decisively. In purely operational terms, he may not have been wrong. German forces were collapsing, supply lines were fractured, and resistance in many sectors was already symbolic. A rapid thrust eastward could have seized more ground before Germany surrendered. But the critical question is not whether Patton could have gone further, it's whether going further would have mattered. By the spring of 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The remaining issue was not military collapse, but political positioning. Territory taken after that point did not belong to whoever arrived first. It belonged to whoever the Allies agreed should administer it. Even if Patton had advanced hundreds of miles, those gains could have been reversed at a conference table. More importantly, Patton's advance would not have changed Soviet intentions or influence. The Red Army was already deep in Eastern Europe, and its presence there was not dependent on how fast American units moved in the West. The shape of post-war Europe was being decided by diplomacy backed by force, not by last-minute races. In that light, Patton's way offered the promise of momentum, not transformation. It could have altered the optics of the war's final weeks, but not its outcome. Eisenhower was not choosing between victory and caution, he was choosing between a clean ending and an unstable one. Patton was not wrong about war, he was wrong about this moment in it. His instincts were forged for breaking enemies, not managing endings. And in 1945, the war in Europe was no longer about destruction, it was about transition. Eisenhower's restraint was not an act of timidity or political weakness. It was an acknowledgement that the battlefield had expanded beyond the front lines. Every mile advanced now carried consequences that would shape the peace, the alliances, and the world that followed. Patton saw unfinished business, Eisenhower saw unfinished history. That tension is why this argument never truly disappears. Patton represents the belief that decisive force can solve problems before they grow. Eisenhower represents the reality that power must sometimes be restrained to prevent larger ones. Both men were shaped by victory, but only one was responsible for what came after it. Patton was not denied his ending because he lacked ability. He was denied it because the war demanded something different than what had brought it this far. His frustration endures because it asks the question we still struggle to answer. When victory is certain, should momentum still be trusted or controlled? That is why Patton didn't finish the war his way, and why, in the end, the war finished the way it did.